Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Town Talk. I'm City Manager Scott Neal. This year, we planned a series of Town Talks around important topics included in the City of Edina's 2020-2021 budget work plan. The city has four primary budget goals: strong foundation, which is all about maintaining physical assets and infrastructure; reliable service, which is about maintaining service levels that best meet the needs of the community; livable city is where we plan for a connected and sustainable development; and finally, better together, where we foster an inclusive and engaged community. Tonight's presentation is about future street funding in Edina. Engineering Director Chad Milner and Street Funding Task Force Chair Ann Swenson will talk about the work and the role of the task force, the public engagement process, and the eventual recommendation which was approved by the City Council earlier this year. Chad and Ann will speak for about 30 minutes. After their presentation, we will take questions. We will end tonight's Town Talk when there are no more questions or at 8 p.m., whichever is first. However, you can continue to ask questions and make comments online at bettertogetheredina.org for the next week. The online conversation closes Tuesday, November 9th. Now I would like to formally introduce Chad, who joined the city staff in 2012. Prior to that, he worked for a Minnesota civil engineering consulting firm in its municipal engineering group. Chad holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in business administration from St. Cloud State. He is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Minnesota. A longtime resident of Edina, Ann Swenson, has given back to the community for decades. She began work with the city as a member of the Planning Commission for about 10 years and went on to serve as a city council member for 12 years, retiring in 2017. She is not retired from public service altogether, though. She is part of the Edina Housing Foundation board and stepped up to be part of and eventually lead the Street Funding Task Force. Please join me in welcoming Chad and Ann.
Evening, everybody. We are going to get through this agenda this evening. We're going to talk about the task force, the public engagement that went into the recommendations and that the task force took into consideration. We'll talk about the revised assessment policy, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So this was our task force members. It was made up of 7 individuals from various neighborhoods across the city. There was some that were previously assessed and some that were not previously assessed with our street reconstruction program. As Scott mentioned, Ann Swenson, sitting next to me, was the chair of the task force, and she'll share the findings of the work that this group did over the course of almost a year.
You know, the purpose of our task force was to develop recommendations for street reconstruction funding. Our first job, though, was a vision statement. And our vision statement was to develop a funding solution that is maintained by the plurality of residents as equitable, is able to maintain Edina's roadways to the city's standards, and finally is financially and legally sustainable. And the legally sustainable part became the most important part. We had 16 meetings from June 30th till February 9th. All of them were done remotely except for one in September where we spaced ourselves out about 20 feet apart and worked for 3 or 4 hours at one of the Edina buildings. Our current method of street assessment is both fair and unfair, and I think that was really the topic that we started with. What is fair? How do we judge fair? How do we view fair? And it is fair in that all residents are subject to the same rules. That's a legal standard. It is unfair that a resident may pay significantly more or less based solely on the density of their neighborhood, the subsoil quality, or what we call subcut, more on that later, and or the need for retaining wall reconstruction on city-owned boulevards. It is unfair that some people will live 30 years or more years in Edina and never experience a special assessment. It is unfair that some people will experience more than one special assessment, which has happened. It is unfair that the current policy assumes all properties within a neighborhood reconstruction project benefit equally, and that properties outside of that project are assumed to receive no benefit. For an example, the current policy allocates all the costs to the residents that live on the street, while other residents get to use the same street free of charge. Edina's current method of allocating 100% of street reconstruction costs as special assessments is kind of an outlier among the Twin Cities metro communities, and we studied what other communities were doing. Any change to our current system will be unfair for those residents who have previously experienced a special assessment and still reside in Edina. I still have a special assessment. 100% of assessment strategy was no longer legally and financially sustainable. And the law says that what you add in benefit, the cost of what you add in benefit to the street, has to be seen in an equal rise in the value of that property. So we needed a change in our policy. There was no legal way to refund past assessments. We went through every option on that. We talked to attorneys. There isn't a possibility for that. And there is no legal way to tax previously assessed properties at different rates. Everyone has to be taxed the same. Our funding recommendations came down to 2 recommendations, and we wanted to present both to the City Council so we could have a conversation about them. The first one was that 50% would eventually remain as special assessments, and the other 50% would go on to the tax levies, and the transition would be over 16 years. The second choice was 100% tax levy transitioned over 16 years. You might ask why we picked 16 years, because year 1 we recommended that the subcut be taken out, and we'll talk more about that as I said later. And the next 15 years right now, if you are paying an assessment and you choose to have it on your tax rolls, you pay it for 15 years. The cost of the subcut would no longer be included in assessments paid in year 1. That subcut was kind of an aha moment for us, because every street is different. And if you move on to a street and 3 years later you're going to have your street redone, and you find out that you have a really bad subcut and you need thousands and thousands of dollars of remediation, where a project a half a mile away from you doesn't need that because their subcut is the kind that can be built almost directly over. That's not fair. You don't have somebody drill a hole in a street when you're buying a house to see what the subcut is. So for us, taking that subcut out became very important. The other cost was retaining walls no longer would be included in the assessments, and they would be paid by taxes in year 1. Retaining walls are really difficult. They can be large. You've seen some of them. Let's say the sidewalk on Interlochen Boulevard. There's a huge retaining wall there, about in the middle of Interlochen. But we need those retaining walls. We need them to make the street safe. We need them for sidewalks. We need them for a lot of different reasons. And yet they can't equally be spread over a neighborhood that has to have it and then somebody else doesn't another mile away. So those 2 items we recommended came out in year 1.
So as part of the task force work, the task force wanted to collect public engagement or public testimony from the community. They based the public engagement scenario on the community engagement and the equity statement of the City Council. So what went out to the public? There was press releases. There was a story and episode of Agenda Edina. There was an article in Edition Edina, lots of social media posts. And overall, to the Better Together website that was created, there was 2,100 total visits, and the task force received 313 feedback forms. And all of those feedback forms came from residential properties. We invited all property types to submit feedback, but we really only heard from the residential properties. So what did the task force hear from those that were previously assessed? And we've heard, I paid my street and it was costly for me. How is it fair for me to now have to pay for other streets? You know, he didn't help me with mine. Can I get a refund or have my future taxes adjusted? Now that wealthy neighborhoods get their streets reconstructed, the system is being modified. Big lots and big homes should pay more. We should keep the current system in place until all the streets are reconstructed. Wouldn't this be the fairest way to proceed? Why not provide more extended financing options to repay future assessments? We also heard neither option is fair or equitable. We also heard from people who were not previously assessed before, and they mentioned finding a way to transition homeowners who have been recently assessed by charging them a lower tax levy rate and then work up to the full share after a few years. There needs to be a way to adequately treat those that have paid assessments recently or in the past 5 or 10 years. And everyone should contribute, have some skin in the game, as road reconstruction is a basic city function. Streets are used by everybody, and we as a community should bear the costs. So those are just a few of the snapshots of those 313 various submissions that we heard and looked through as the task force did their work. So it ultimately came to pass. The task force presented those two options that Ann had mentioned. Staff then came back in April and presented one option that we recommended, and council recommended we bring it back again in July with some tweaks. And this was the option that ultimately got adopted in July of 2021, was to go to 100% tax levy transitioned over 16 years. And this table shows that impact to the median family home in Edina. So the first column, it's a reduction in the special assessment. So we started at 100% special assessments. Year one, to take care of the subcuts and retaining walls, the assessment reduced by 21%. And then over those transitioned years, over year 2 to 16, it dropped 5.3% approximately over those years. If you go to the last two columns, so the one is the dollar increase in taxes for the median value home. So that year one is the big jump, so it's almost $38. And years 2 through 16, it's almost $11 per year. And that would be an increase in either 2.5% tax increase to that median family home, or a 0.67% increase during those transition years of 2 through 16. So what's this look like from a cumulative standpoint, the tax impacts on a median value home? So you can see these are columns on the top is years. So year one is 2022. 6 years in is that second column at 2027. The 11th year is at 2032. And then that 16th year, or the final year of this transition, would be in 2037. So if you look at them, at the cumulative impacts of the tax, that year one, like we mentioned, is just under $40 at $37.90. By year 6, it's accumulated to $385. By year 11, it's $994. And by the end of that 16-year transition, that's median valued home would have paid $1,865 in additional taxes to cover the street reconstruction costs. And then we did an estimated assessment during that same transition period, because homes are still going to be assessed from year 1 through 16. So assuming a $10,000 assessment, the home that would be assessed for street recon would have that initial assessment of $7,890 with that tax rate of just under $40. And in year 6, it would have almost a half the assessment at $5,200. And at that point, the assessment would have dropped nearly $5,000, and they would have paid $385 in total taxes at that point. And then year 16, that home there will not have zero special assessment for street reconstruction, and that cumulative would again be $1,865 is the cumulative taxes. And then the tax on that last year for that median value home would be $195 for street reconstruction. So we wanted to make sure we covered that in the policy. So in the policy, there's a table in the appendix, and this is that table. It's hard to read on the screen, but it just lays out the year of construction, because we wanted to make sure we knew exactly what we were doing from a staff standpoint, no matter who was in the chair making the assessment recommendations to the city council over those 16 years. So we have the year of construction, and then we have the assessment year. So like we usually do, we have construction one year, and then we assess the fall of the following year. So for example, this year, construction 2021 is that year one row. We're going to assess in 2022, and there's that 21% reduction. And then there's some example calculations with different various assessment rates. So this just allows us to be accurate with what we're doing, no matter who is applying those assessments to our reconstruction program for the next 16 years or until 2037. So we know street funding is difficult and it's a challenging topic. Priorities and funding, the understandings change over time, and we need to change our policies to adapt to those changes. And again, changes in those understandings require changes in the funding methods, and that's what you're seeing with the change in the policy that was adopted in July. And they may not always align with resident expectations, but something needed to be done, and the council made that change in July based on the feedback from the Street Funding Task Force. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Scott and see if there's any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to ask a question, please press star 1 on your phone's keypad. Again, to ask a question, please press star 1 on your phone's keypad. Your first question comes from the line of Andrew Brown from 5512 Park Place. Your line is now open.
Good evening. Andrew Brown, 5512 Park Place in Edina, the Minnehaha Woods neighborhood. We had our street reconstruction done a number of years ago when Ms. Swenson was on the council and Mr. Milner was with SEH. I see there's a lot of talk about fair and unfair, and I'm sorry about this, but it really strikes hard when the other neighborhoods in that year, reconstruction year, got City of Edina engineering services, and my neighborhood didn't. We got SEH, and that was double the amount of any other neighborhood at that time for engineering services, which was roughly about $2,000 more than any other neighborhood for engineering services at that time. And I don't know if you remember this, Ms. Swenson, but I actually did a spreadsheet summary of all those expenses. And then it was deemed later that we weren't doing a very good job of time tracking, so that's why the difference was. And then secondly, I understand things change over time, but I had to put my sewer line all the way into the city-owned property at the T section there. And then the very next year it was deemed, well, that probably wasn't legal for the City of Edina to do that, and that I was really only probably responsible to the boulevard. So then again, there was more charges that I and my neighbors had to bear more than was necessary. So I understand this is a tightrope, this is a balancing act, and things change over time, but this is really where neighbors and neighborhoods get really frustrated by what City Hall does. So
before Ann and Chad have a chance to respond to that, I think I just want to give the information again about how to call in. If you're watching from home, you can call 800-374-0221 with conference ID 4133679. Press star 1 on your telephone keypad when you're ready to ask a question. The operator will mute your line, place you into a queue until it's your time to speak. When it is your turn, Communications Director Jennifer Bennerat will introduce you. Chad? Ann?
You know, you're right. I hear your frustration, and you're right, I was a part of that frustration, and I'm sorry for that. That's the hardest thing about street reconstruction, and the fact that we couldn't legally continue on even where we were. You know, your case aside, where you didn't feel you'd been treated the same as maybe another neighborhood that was done that year. I think if we're all going to start and say we're making this new city and we're going to figure out how we're going to reconstruct the streets 50 years down the road, we would have come up with a plan that we probably came up with now, that we would just put it in taxes and not worry about it. You know, we blithely went along, well, not blithely, but we went along doing our oldest streets first. And our oldest streets first happened to be the neighborhoods that tended to be the same lot size. And so we didn't run into as many issues with what the assessment was, because everyone lived in, a story and a half or a rambler or a split level, and they all had a 75 or 125 foot lot, and they hadn't had a rebuild in their neighborhood that was worth $2 million, and then we had a house next door that was worth $700,000. That causes to happen, but that really isn't. I know you're not happy about what's happening with the change, but I also hear what you're saying is you were really frustrated when you went through the process, and I'm sorry you feel that way.
And I can speak to the the private sewer pipe requirements at the time. From an infrastructure standpoint, great idea. I think everybody should rehab their sewer pipes because there's clean water going into those pipes that we need to now pay for as it leaves the city at the Met Council. We get charged for all that clean water. So I think it was a great program to do that, and also the water services, to upgrade your water service to a new service was a good idea. The former director had a different opinion of the legal ability to require residents to do that than I did when I took over a couple years later than after your project. So we changed that to be more comfortable with the current legal proceedings, but we still offer that program as an option. So all of our residents have that option to do those pipes and put it on their assessment because it is such an important part of the infrastructure, and I wish more people would take advantage of it.
And it's a good way to finance what can be a pretty hefty cost.
Exactly.
I've done the water one separately. It is hefty, I can tell you that, and we had no water to our house for 6 weeks. We had to borrow water from our neighbor's hose, so would have been nice if I had done that when our street was done.
Do we have another question, Jennifer?
We do have other people on the call listening in, but no one is indicating a desire to speak at this time. As a reminder, if you'd like to speak, please press the asterisk symbol and then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. That's the asterisk, not the pound sign. And then we will be able to introduce you. With that, I do have another caller. Operator, please unmute the line of Ms. Lori Groats. Ms. Groats, please begin by stating your full name and address for the record.
Thank you. Lori Groats, 5513 Park Place. One of the reasons I have problems with this is what the council did I don't think was ethical. When they started with street assessments, way back when Country Club was doing it, and we had a different city engineer, the city council had asked the city engineer, how large of assessments do you think this is going to be for homes? And back then, 15, 20 years ago, they were told $30,000 to $35,000. And the council didn't have any problem with it. And what it appears to be is the council continued to charge everybody 100% for their street assessment minus the curb and the gutter until some attorneys in a neighborhood finally came up and decided, okay, we're being charged more than what we're getting out of this, and it's not going to be legal, and so we're going to sue the city. And it was at that time they decided to change the policy. So they got by doing half of the streets in the city before they got caught with their pants down. And I'm sure that there were plenty of neighborhoods that paid more than what they should have for their values. However, people weren't aware of at the time that the assessment could not be greater than what the value would be to the home. And I think that happened in our neighborhood. And we did have tear downs in our neighborhood with expensive homes next to smaller homes. So they did this, the council did this as long as they could get by with it before they finally got caught. And I just don't think that was ethical. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I can touch on that a little bit. The benefit test, the special assessments, like Ann mentioned, are supposed to provide a market benefit to the properties. So again, since I've been here, we've been doing benefit letters, us having an appraiser do a letter to make sure all the assessments that we've levied in the last 10 years have met that market benefit test. So the first one that we were concerned about was at Prospect Knolls that kind of triggered the work of the task force. And we clearly communicated to the council that there's a portion of these neighbors or portion of these properties that may not meet this test. But you really, truly will not know until you get individual appraisals of each property and then go into the project. So that's what kind of triggered the work of the task force to say that this is one of probably more neighborhoods coming, and now is the time to really look at that policy. I can't speak to what the council was thinking 15, 20 years ago or what they were saying, but that's at least what we have done to make sure that that market benefit test is met. And we're still doing that today with our assessments. We have assessments going to be considered by the council in December, and we're doing those letters just to make sure that we are comfortable with those projects coming forward with the assessments, to also make sure that it falls within the ranges of the benefits for each of those individual properties. So thank you, Lori, for calling in.
Again, we do have a few more people on the line. If you're interested in speaking, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. That's the asterisk symbol, then the number 1. There is a slight delay in the broadcast, so I would recommend we wait 30 seconds or so before wrapping up.
Okay.
I show 7:26. I'll come back to you in about 30 seconds unless someone pops in.
Okay. Chad, while we're waiting, can you give us a preview about what areas of town are included in the 2022 projects?
Yeah, great question. So we got two neighborhoods, or one neighborhood and one kind of a street. So the one neighborhood is the Morningside near Weber Park. So there's a portion of that being considered in 2022, and then a portion in 2023, but we're only going to have that council consider the 22 project area. And then the other street is a municipal state aid street. So it's Blake Road and Interlochen from the Hopkins border down through the intersection of Blake and Interlochen, across the land bridge and down the Shriver Road. So that's a very important corridor of our city. And we're looking to make some pretty good improvements there from a transportation and a bike ped facility standpoint along Mirror Lake, right in that area. So we're looking forward to share those projects with the council on, I think it's Monday, December 13th at those public hearings.
Great. Thanks, Chad.
We do not have anyone else in the queue, Manager Neal, so I think you can wrap it up.
All right. Well, first thing I want to do is before we wrap up, I want to thank Chad and Ann for joining us tonight and for taking on the leadership of a very difficult situation, a very difficult policy situation to resolve. So thank you for your leadership in doing that for your community. As a reminder, you can continue to ask questions and make comments about the city's plan for street funding online at bettertogetheredina.org for the next week. The online conversation closes on Tuesday, November 9th. I want to thank everybody for watching and for participating tonight, and have a great night. Thank you.